Point Blank is a crime fiction podcast. It may not be suitable for all listeners. We discuss violence in all its forms. The works we reference may include period slang, which some listeners may find offensive. The hosts also have a tendency to swear.
Episode 17, Part 2, In a Lonely Place by Dorothy Hughes. And welcome back to Point Blank for Part 2 of our discussion of In a Lonely Place by Dorothy Hughes. My name is Kurt, and joining me once again, here's Justin.
Hey folks, holy crap, I have a lot of books stacked up in front of me right now.
Well, be careful they don't fall over on top of you, Justin.
Yeah, that's a price I'm willing to, or a risk I'm willing to take, price I'm willing to pay.
Well, if something is going to take me out, if it's a giant pile of books falling on top of me, I'm okay with that.
Yeah, it's either that or a Nile's crocodile or a great white shark. Those are the three ways.
Yeah, did you happen to see the other day in the news these people free diving with a great white shark in Hawaii?
Yeah, they called her the gentle grandma. She's like 50 plus years old.
I have a lot of respect for wildlife. I would love to see a great white shark in the wild, but there is no way in hell I'm going to be free diving next to a great white shark and grabbing its fin. No way.
I think it would depend on the situation, but for me, the situation they were in is not one I would want to be in. They had, the Hawaiian authorities had dragged I think a sperm whale carcass out to the deep water, and there was a feeding frenzy out there. They said there were dozens of sharks, tigers, and great whites, and this massive shark, 20 plus feet, like 7-8 feet wide, was in the area. So sure, if they're alone out there and they're really docile, maybe, but not when you're in the vicinity of another few dozen ravenous sharks. It just seems like a foolish choice. But hey, I'm also not going to hang out with grizzlies for 17 years and then be eaten by them. So.
Well, people, I guess, choose to live their lives, and if they do that and get eaten by a shark, well, then I guess you had it coming.
Yeah, live and let live.
That's right. Well, we're back at Point Blank, and I guess that's sort of crime-related, or how to dispose of a body. You could put it by a whale carcass and let sharks eat it. But I thought I would start the show out today by talking about a couple of TV shows that are crime-related I've been watching. Have you been watching anything decent lately, Justin?
Well, I actually started The Expanse, which is sci-fi noir or sci-fi with a private detective element. And I'm not sure if you reviewed The Expanse early on, but I'm in halfway through season 1. And while I think there are some flaws in the show, I really love the production quality, the sort of gritty future where we don't have all the accoutrements of a Star Trek universe. It's sort of like a Cold War future between the Earth and Mars and Belters, the people who live in sort of colonies out in the solar system. It's just a real wicked, sort of like the kind of stuff that you want, the gritty, neo-realist Star Wars stuff from the early films without all the flash and utopianism of Star Trek. So I've loved it so far, but I'm not really deep into it yet.
Yeah, the first season of The Expanse, and I do love The Expanse, definitely has that detective element to it. That does change a little bit in the future of the show, but it's always hard when you're watching sci-fi television because I feel like you have to sort of lower the bar from your initial expectations compared to everything else that's out there. The Expanse, like you said, there are a couple of flaws in the show, but really, I mean, it's definitely the best science fiction space show on television right now, in my opinion. I'm glad that I know it was canceled by the Sci-Fi Channel. I'm glad that Amazon has picked it up for future seasons because I think the novels also are particularly good. So
yes, I bought one. So I'm gonna, once I'm done with the series, I'm gonna read the novel and see how they compare. So.
Well, I've been watching more TV than I normally do. I've been needing some real distraction of late, and that's led to me watching some more TV. So I have a couple of crime related shows I've been watching, and the first one is Damnation. And now you should know right off the start that this was canceled after the first season, and it is not a perfect show by any means. But it is a subject that is so rarely covered in television or film for that matter. This one is set in 1931 during the Depression in the United States, and it takes place in Iowa. It's essentially the story of labor wars between the farmers and industrialists trying to move into the area. And it really covers this very hidden aspect of American history. I enjoyed it. I would recommend it with hesitation because there's some problems with the plot. Their pacing is a little off. Characters can be a little convoluted, and I definitely think they made a mistake by mostly concentrating on characters from outside of Iowa rather than concentrating on the farmers themselves. But that said, it is only one season, and I think the latter episodes do pay off for some of the slower early and mid-season episodes. The showrunner describes it as 1/3 Clint Eastwood, 1/3 John Steinbeck, and 1/3 James Ellroy. That might be a bit generous, but if you're at all interested in a story set in the Midwest of America during this rural Midwest, on top of that, during this Depression era, I think this one would be an interesting one to check out. Now, the next one is called Happy. This is based on a graphic novel. It's that kind of graphic novel noir. It's over the top, but that said, it's definitely within this crime genre. You follow ex-cop Nick Sachs, who has become a hitman after abuses of alcohol, drugs. He's like constantly having heart attacks and having to take these drugs, but he's basically unkillable. What happens with him is that his daughter, who he doesn't even know exists at the beginning of the series, is kidnapped by this like crazy Santa Claus guy, and it takes place around Christmas time. And her imaginary friend is like this unicorn thing named Happy, which is voiced by Patton Oswalt. He goes out in search of Nick Sachs, who's played by Christopher Maloney, probably best known from Law and Order SVU, but he does a great job with this fallen cop in this series. And it's crazy, it's over the top, it's almost borderline superhero-ish, but I really enjoyed it. Now that it's after Christmas time, it might not be as timely, but it's if you're into that comic book graphic novel noir style, I think you could do way worse than checking out Happy.
Yeah, I've heard good things about that. I'm glad that you give it a fair review.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things it's not going to be for everybody, but I enjoyed it. And I have one more, and this is a documentary, and I hesitate to bring this up, but Justin, are you familiar with the Fyre Festival at all?
Oh, FYRE,
Yes.
The big festival last year that ended up being a scam. Everybody got sort of bilked out of their money. The whole thing fell apart.
Yep, that's the one.
Yes. I'm glad I didn't get tickets.
No, I don't think either one of us could afford tickets. I think they started at $10,000 a ticket.
Oh, so it was this elitist affair on a beach island kind of. Okay.
Yes. And I mean, that's kind of, there's many different ways to look at this festival. And there's actually two documentaries that have come out. There's one on Netflix and one on Hulu. If you're interested in sort of this modern, I guess I would call it the modern con game, the investor culture, the startup culture, the bullshit culture of a lot of these ideas that are really nothing. The idea of internet influencers and celebrity culture that just goes horribly wrong, then you may find these documentaries to be entertaining. I mean, it's tragic in the sense that people believe this shit, and it's really weird as somebody who doesn't buy into celebrity culture, doesn't buy into social influencers and entrepreneurs and all this sort of modern capitalism idea, that to watch how this unfolds and how all these people get sort of sucked into this disaster of a festival, and nobody really is willing to put their foot down. And it's also an interesting lesson in how the idea of things like, well, we're going to think positive, can be warped in by somebody who is this manipulative individual. And like when you don't have housing for thousands of people who are showing up in 6 days and somebody says, well, we need to cancel people. And the person in charge turns around and goes, well, we're a solution-based thing. We need to think positively here.
Uh-huh.
It's just amazing to see how these concepts can be so manipulated, so misconceived to have no connection to reality whatsoever.
That sounds like a massive delusion mixed with incredible privilege.
Oh, for sure. And it is, you can sit back and laugh at it, but I think on the other hand, it's also an interesting documentary to see how people go down that road. And in the elements to relate this to crime fiction, like if you were going to work on or read a modern crime fiction piece, I think this documentary would do a lot of good to show you how the modern consumer, the modern worker or whatever might get sucked into this whirlpool of failure.
Totally. Yeah, I mean it's frightening, it's sobering, it's alarming, but it's also, there's something pathetically human about it.
So that's something for you to watch over the next little bit. Let's get into our main topic for today, which is In a Lonely Place by Dorothy Hughes. Justin, would you like to start us off with a summary again of the book?
Indeed. I'll give you the longer version this time. So Dorothy B Hughes wrote In a Lonely Place. This wasn't her first book. This was sort of a early in her career to mid-career noir piece. It was published in 1947, and it's set in post-war Los Angeles, much like our previous book, Walter Mosley's Devil in a Blue Dress. Unlike Mosley's novel, however, this one is straight-up noir. Things are dark, things are mysterious. The character in particular that guides us through the story is a bad guy for which things end badly. The book was made into a well-regarded film noir starring Bogart and Gloria Graham, and that came out 3 years after the book, though the film version, based on what I've heard, is quite different from the book, so it's almost like a different movie or story. Anyway, this book is about main character Dix Steele, and yes, listeners, you heard that right. His name is Dix Steele, D-I-X, so let's get our sophomore humor out of the way. I don't think that the name is tongue-in-cheek, but I don't know for sure because I have never read anything about Dorothy Hughes speaking to her naming conventions. But the main character is Dix Steele. He's an ex-airman who served in England during World War II. He's a recent arrival to L.A., and he's there to do work on his novel. That's what he says. He is a fledgling author, and he's living off of his wealthy uncle's monthly patronage. He stays in an apartment of an acquaintance, a guy he knew from the war days. This acquaintance has gone off to Rio de Janeiro, leaving his apartment to Dix for a time. And so Dix is living on borrowed time. He's in a certain place. It's not his own home. He's borrowing a place to live. He's living off of somebody else's dime. And he's got this mysterious, sad, existential quality to him. He wanders the foggy city at night. He roams aimlessly, talking to himself. It's first person, so we're in his head often in the book as he pieces together his... Actually, it's not first person, it's intimate third person. But we're very close to Dix in the story. And he feels that nothing compares to his days as a fighter pilot. He's one of those guys who thrives on the glory days, nostalgia, back when he was a great hero and everybody loved him. So we're catching him during a turn in his life where things are a little darker. He's disillusioned, and he has a pretty nasty habit that we learn about vaguely, relatively quickly in the story. Early on, he meets his detective friend, whose name is Brub, with whom he did military service, and he meets Brub's wife named Sylvia. They live in a nice house close to the ocean. Brub is working on a case of a serial killer who's been strangling women in the Los Angeles area, And Dix is interested in the case because, of course, he's working on a novel, and it's a crime novel. And he asks questions to Brub. Brub is happy to answer because it helps him to think out the crime and maybe get a new insight and new leads. So it's a nice symbiotic relationship. Of course, the reader realizes fairly quickly that Dick Steele has ulterior motives and that he's not who he claims to be to Brub. He is, in fact, the serial strangler in the story. And the magic of this story is that the crazy tension we feel as readers only grows as we come to know who Dix is and as he gets closer to Brub and other members of the LAPD, and he continues his criminal acts, his violent acts, off camera, and we get to see how he processes his actions and rationalizes them. And it's just really intriguing, and it's a magic balancing act that Hughes performs for us as readers. The question isn't so much will he get away with it, it's how will he be caught and when. He is good about covering his tracks, Dix is. He's very smart, he plays this game. And in the end, the way the Dix show falls apart is very well done, and it's a nice feminist twist on familiar genre tropes. Overall, I love this book. This is a cool inversion of what happens in this novel. The protagonist is the bad guy, which, isn't exactly new now, but this was written in 1947. This preceded Jim Thompson's The Killer Inside Me. So if you like Lou Ford, you like being in the head of the bad guy, this book came first. Also, this has women characters who, in a more generic crime fiction or detective story, might have been femme fatales, but in this case, they act as off-page detectives and are working behind the scenes to solve the case, but though we don't see that until the end. The writing is top-notch. The New York Review of Books calls Hughes' writing controlled elegance, and I couldn't agree more. The sentences are sharp and lyrical, the characters are well developed, and the atmosphere is the best I've read since David Goodis's Shoot the Piano Player. Dick Steele is part Lou Ford, part Humbert from Lolita, and to me, entirely believable. He's a wounded white man in a changing world who fills his emptiness with misogynistic violence. The magic is that Hughes crafts Dix in a way that keeps the reader hooked. I give it 5 hits.
Yeah, and I can't disagree. I'm going to give that 5 hits as well. I mean, this is a solid noir tale. And I think you mentioned something about a balancing act of what Hughes gives us in this. And I think that is one of the things that propels this book forward, is that the balance is so well done in here. The way that she handles the characters, the way that she builds the suspense, the way that she builds our look into the inner workings of Dix's mind is very well done. It's handled, and as that review said, with controlled elegance. We're looking at the work of a master of this genre because of how those things are handled. It's a type of writing that was probably pretty new at this time, and I know that we probably said that A Killer Inside Me was the first novel that came from the killer's point of view, and we were wrong about that. So I won't say that this is the first one, but it may be one of the first that was popular. And boy, to see that handled well, and in today we're seeing people still copy this style, and it can be mishandled so much.
Oh, easily, yeah.
Yeah, and Hughes just handles that masterfully. On our Goodreads group, which you should check out because we do have a lot of discussion before recording the podcast there. There'll be a link in the show notes. One of our listeners, Jay, said that the sinister atmosphere she invokes is the essence of noir. And I cannot agree more with that, because this to me really feels like classic noir. It's right there. It's what I want from a noir novel.
Totally. And, anybody can write. Some people can write very well, but masters are those who know not just how to write, but how to subtract and how to control what the reader sees and feels through what's left out. The creation of nice plot devices that leave out critical information or information that would stall or reduce the suspense or thrill moments at times in a crime fiction novel. And, most of the readers or writers we've read are solid at this, but you can tell when you're reading just this quality of work where control is at its utmost, where you know that the author was very deliberate about what the choices they made. And this is at least as good as The Killer Inside Me. One of our listeners, Jeff, called it a 5-star book, but he said he didn't quite love the ending. He felt that the Dix character sort of just gave up at the end. I think we'll talk about the ending a little bit later on, but he said that it was the ending that stopped this book from being better than The Killer Inside Me. And I don't quite agree with that. I think this book is as good, but that's going to be a sticking point for some, perhaps, and we'll get to that a little bit later on in the episode.
Sure.
What about characters? We have a handful of characters in this story. We have the aforementioned Dix Steele, protagonist and serial strangler. We have Brub, Steele's war buddy and current detective in the LAPD. We have Sylvia, who is Brub's young wife, who Dix struggles to get a read on. It seems like he is trying to understand who she is, and something about, there's a disconnect there throughout the story, and we find out why later on. And then the fourth person who I think are the four key or primary characters is the woman by the name of Laurel Gray, who is upstairs apartment dweller in Dick Steele's apartment complex and becomes his love interest. I didn't mention her before, but she ends up being sort of critical to the plot. She comes into the story a little bit later, though. Are there other characters that stand out or you've valued, or is one of these four characters a character that really, worked for you?
I think, again, we're talking about mastery of the form, and that Hughes does really well here, is that I think those four characters, that's our crucial character. Then she gives us some secondary characters like the other detectives, a couple of other society people and whatnot, but they really don't have much influence, nor should they have much influence on the story.
No, because we don't need them. I mean, so much, all the tension's coming from, because it's all about secrets, and it's all about who knows what. And
yes,
I mean, you want suspense. You put a murderer in the room with the detective trying to solve the murder, and feed him dinner. And like every time that Brub and Dix get together at the society community club or wherever they go for dinner, wherever white people eat in like upper middle class LA, but they'd end up in this room drinking martinis and conversing. And every time that happened, I was just like at the edge of my seat. I'm like, oh, what's going to slip here? Who's going to fuck up? How is Steele going to reveal his hand or make a mistake? And each time that he didn't, got us closer to the time that he would. And so I didn't want anybody else in the story would be a distraction. This was such an intimate book.
Yes. But what I think, again, talking about handling the characters well, the decision to put two characters who do play a pretty big secondary role in the book, to make them never appear on screen, was a really good choice for Hughes. And I'm thinking of Mel Terrace, the guy whose apartment Dix is in.
Yes.
And we're always referencing him. Oh, he's in Rio de Janeiro.
Yes, he comes up.
Oh, he's off in Rio.
Yeah, he comes up over and over for a character we never see, almost like a token. He's just he's a plot device.
And Brucey, the Army nurse or Air Force nurse or whatever that Dix had a love interest in back in England during the war, and that Brub also knows, but she is referenced often enough in the text. But we don't have, maybe another author would have done some kind of flashback scene or something like that, which wouldn't have worked as elegantly as the way that it's referenced in this particular book. So I really like that Hughes focuses on these four characters, gives us secondary characters that are in and out of the scene, and then gives us these, I'm not quite sure what you want to call them, but off-screen characters that can propel parts of the narrative as well, but isn't confusing the actual story taking place.
So much of the story is characters in a room having conversations, but it's not all about what people are saying. It's so often about what people are not saying. It's about a gesture,
yes,
or a silence, or the twist of a lip, or the way that someone's eyes are expressing something, and the inability for somebody like Dick Steele to read somebody. And it's amazing how much tension Hughes was able to squeeze out of these these moments of essentially gesticulation or body language, because that's hard to do on the page. We depend on words, and she was able to use body language effectively in the story, because when Dix couldn't read somebody, he couldn't control them or couldn't control the narrative, and he needed the narrative in order to preserve his identity and preserve his secrets, essentially. And one of those secrets is tied to Brucey, which is backstory, but we don't see Brucey, like you said. We don't actually see anybody die in this story. Nobody dies on the page. Everybody dies off screen, which is another pretty interesting move by Hughes.
And to go back to your original question, you ask, well, who are the most compelling characters to me? And it's really Sylvia and Laurel. What's interesting about that is you don't realize that until the end of the book.
Yes, and once you get to the end, you can, like, I'm curious about rereading and seeing how these two characters, Sylvia and Laura, their behaviors, their mannerisms, the things they say and don't say, how much that reveals how far or how early on you can see the end coming once you know what it is, because it's subtle.
Yeah, and I had to think back on that, because when you read the book the first time, and I don't know if this is really a criticism or not, but because it's making me think that's a positive, is I was like, well, why was Sylvia so skeptical of Dix? I guess to look at this relationship, the fact that Brub is his war buddy, and like he's got his blinders on to the Dix who he flew with back in the war and whatnot.
Yes.
And willing to look at him in the best light, and even though he's supposed to be the detective, he continually says, well, even though the evidence is pointing towards Dick repeatedly in the latter half of the story, he's kind of always giving Dix an out. And Sylvia, and I was like, well, why is it that Sylvia seems to know that something's going on right from the get-go? And I had to think about that. And it really does make sense when you think back of the initial meeting at the beginning of the book when Dix goes to meet Sylvia and Brub.
Yes.
And she questions him. She goes, well, how long have you been in town now?
Yes.
And he's like, he's been there for like 4 or 5 months or something. They knew that Dix was coming to town, and then he just shows up unannounced. Now, if I was moving to Albuquerque or you were moving to Seattle, if you or I moved to one of those locations and you just got done unpacking or whatever, and you came over and you said hello and you didn't call ahead of time, that would be normal. If you waited 3 or 4 months and then you just showed up unexpectedly at the front door, that would be a little bit strange.
Yes, it'd be unsettling, and it would raise questions without easy answers. And Sylvia isn't blinded by her nostalgia, her past relationship. She's looking at Dick soberly with a clean slate, and she just sees a disconnect there, and that sets the stage for all the disconnects that follow, essentially, because he's schmoozy, but he's also reserved. But she can probably tell how he plays Brub. She knows Brub better than anybody in the story. So, but we never get inside her head, so we can't really know all the wheels that are turning in her brain as she watches this guy she knows really well be subtly played and manipulated by Dix. We can't even see it ourselves because we don't know the character. She probably knows this character, Brub, more intimately than anybody else knows anybody in the story.
Again, this is sort of with the killer inside me, too, is that, when you finish the book, you have to remind yourself that the majority of the information we've gotten in this case, is through Dix's eyes.
Yeah, the classic unreliable narrator.
He perceives Laurel as being sort of this Hollywood airhead or whatever, and she picks up on what Dix is up to probably before anybody else. I mean, she knows that something is amiss the day, and I think this is about halfway through the book, when Brub lets Dix know that they know that Brucey was killed back in England. And then he disappears for the night, and he was supposed to meet up with Laurel, and he shows up at like 6 a.m, and she's like, well, where were you? He kind of gives a half-ass response, and then from there on, their relationship, or her relationship to him, completely changes, and his obsession with her just increases. that's an interesting part that she sees this, and not only that, she knows to get with Sylvia, and the two of them really are the ones who figure out Dix is the murderer here.
I mean, I liked Laurel. I didn't love Laurel. I think I was a little confused by her character, but I think you're right in that she probably has the most intimate knowledge of Dick. She sees him on the ground level. They live close together, and they were intimate sexually. And he does spurn her. He disappears, and he keeps odd hours, and he's gone. And then the things he says doesn't add up. And what is brought to mind for me is the ultimate question: why hasn't Dix been caught earlier? It seems like because we're living in his head. We're getting his unreliable rationalization for his behavior. But when we actually see him engaging with other characters, it doesn't seem like he has the genius to deflect or protect himself from scrutiny, because he says he's a little weird. He keeps to himself. He says stuff that almost implicates himself, but says it in a way that's so disarming that it washes over people and they don't buy in. But there's a part of me that feels like he's almost blatant through the story to anybody he's intimate with, which means anytime he's with people, he's at risk. And I guess if he's a loner for the majority of his time as a serial killer, then that would explain why he's not caught. But why would he allow himself to be with people and run the risk? I guess there's an excitement for him in the risk of getting caught. If there wasn't, he wouldn't have befriended Brub, I guess. But it just raises questions for me about who is Dick Steele, and it clearly points to him being a pretty complex guy.
Yeah, and that's where we get into what a modern reader might see in this story, and that's what today we would call PTSD. And I'm not sure that I necessarily buy that this story is a story of PTSD, but let's work with that for right now, because a number of our listeners did mention that on Goodreads. So the idea there is, there's definitely the traumatic experience of being a fighter pilot during World War II. And, historically, one of the big things there that was different from, say, being in the Army is that your moments of terror were very much like contained. Like, you go on this flight, your chances of being shot down were extremely high. You do the mission, you land, and then you're back in rural England or something, and you can go to the pub and relax. Like, that is it really hard on the body, rather than it's actually harder than being constantly exposed to danger. So it's something to think about when looking at this character. There's an obvious trauma and we don't get into a lot of the details, but we do find out that Dix, and I think the reader can put this together pretty early on, that Dix killed Brucey back in England.
Because she was strangled like all the other women, it's a pretty obvious connection, his intimacy and the method of murder.
Exactly. And the thing that we don't have, and might be something you would see in a modern version of this, is what triggered that death. Did he do that intentionally? Did he have some kind of flashback thing, and he did that out of terror, some kind of weird situation like that? We don't know that.
Yeah. So
he's recreating this initial crime, and there is a thing where he's targeting women who look a bit like her. So there's that connection. Now, I would argue that the reason that he goes to Brub in the first place is that he is ready to either A, be caught, or B, he's found that the high that he found while flying in wartime has not been recreated by doing these murders that he is doing.
Yes, perhaps the murder isn't enough. Just shooting a bad guy without the risk. You need to have the risk element, the risk of being killed or being caught by flying over enemy territory.
Exactly. And he's constantly ramping up the risk during the course of this story, whether that is engaging in more activities with Brub, or, being more suggestive or asking questions, or if that's returning to the diner where he had that coffee with the one woman he ended up murdering. Yep. He's ramping up that tension to try to I guess in my eyes, to find that adrenaline rush that he used to have flying.
Totally.
I would say that he's challenging. He's specifically challenging Brub in this case because he knows that Brub was another fighter pilot, and that he's like the only one who's going to give him the challenge that he needs.
I think that's a fair argument assessment. It makes sense. Why would you get so close? What's driving? What's his motive for getting close with Brub at this moment? And I feel like that's the only one that really explains it satisfactorily. He needs it to help fulfill his high.
Yeah, and then there's the cliche too, which we've seen, probably, or at least I can think of probably a half a dozen sort of war movie books or TV things, where a character says, well, they say, well, you're going to die now, and it's after the war. And there's like, well, no, I died back in France in 44 or something. And I wonder if there's a little bit of that element at play here as well. And maybe we're reading too much into the character, but for the time period, it makes a lot of sense.
But the good thing about this book, why it's considered well written, why I find it to be, is that we don't get this in the book. We're speculating on what the origin story of Dick Steele's pathology is, because Hughes didn't overwrite. She didn't try to explain everything. She withheld so much from this book to give us the straight story and let it speak for itself. And that's why I think it's a classic.
Oh, for sure. That is, I would agree with that 100%.
Obviously, the atmosphere in this book, we both are on board with calling this one of the best pieces of atmospheric noir we've read on Point Blank. And the writing, beautiful sentence by sentence prose. There's strong female characters. Are there any aspects of the craft in this story that you want to talk about that we haven't?
Just because we've been mostly talking positives here, maybe we should address that comment from Jeff on Goodreads about the ending being unsatisfactory.
Sure. Let me read it in full what he said. He said, I find the ending quite disappointing. It felt a bit like Dix just went, "It's a fair cop, Gov," and gave up. I think that the weakness of the ending stopped this from being a better novel than Killer Inside Me, even though the quality of the writing was beyond anything he'd read for some time. So he feels like Dix gave up at the end once he got found out, as opposed to The Killer Inside Me, where it becomes more of a violent incident when he gets discovered. It's more like there's like a rampage and there's trouble and there's a lot of the stakes, I guess, seem higher and there's more people actively playing a part in the ending there. I don't know. What did you think? Do you think Dick Steele sort of just drops his hands and say, "You got me," and walks casually to his prison cell?
I can see both sides of this one. For me, I did feel that it was a little bit abrupt. To me, it made sense, but I could see how someone else would say, well, that was kind of unsatisfactory or unsatisfying. Maybe one more scene would have given us a little more satisfaction.
Yeah, there was no, the denouement was not there. It says it hits the climax and then stops. It doesn't give us the letdown or the aftermath. I don't think stories need it all the time, but I could see why some would feel like that abruptness was a little bit jarring, especially for a book that wasn't a very jarring book. It wasn't built on hard-boiled language and grit. It was built on the slow, steady, controlled reveal. So the suddenness of the ending feels maybe incongruent with the rest of the book, perhaps.
Okay, yeah, I can agree with that.
But I didn't feel it. When I read it, I was just like, oh, that's a fucking great book. I didn't go, the ending for me didn't have that dissatisfaction. So
yeah, this is, I mean, even if we can disagree a little bit on the ending, I think this is definitely a good book to say that it's the journey, not the destination necessarily, that really makes this one.
Totally.
And the journey that Hugh gives us in this is a dark noir tale.
And a good one at that. Megan Abbott writes the afterword to this book, and she also writes a piece in an essay in the Paris Review from 2017. She calls reading this novel for the first time like finding the long-lost final piece to an enormous puzzle. With its Spanish bungalows, its eucalyptus-scented shadows, you feel as though you've discovered a delicious and dark secret, a tantalizing page-turner with sneakily subversive undercurrents. While only intermittently, she continues, this book was in print intermittently for much of the last half century, yet its influence on crime fiction is unsung. From Patricia Highsmith and Jim Thompson to Bret Easton Ellis and Thomas Harris, nearly every serial killer tale of the last 70 years bears the imprint of this book, in terms of its sleek, relentless style and its claustrophobic mind of the criminal perspective. But its larger influence derives from Hughes' uncanny grasp of the connection between violence and misogyny and an embattled masculinity. I read this after I wrote up my little synopsis, but it hits on all the notes that I feel this book exemplified. And I couldn't agree with Abbott more about the impact of this book. It's sort of that quiet impact, the way that Red Harvest influenced so many generations of future hard-boiled novels and film. This book seems to have been like the godmother of so much serial killer noir and atmospheric noir, that the fact that we didn't read this before Cornell or Woolrich shows probably patriarchy in action, but also, probably just that, really. Why do we know Cornell Woolrich, who writes a bunch of crappy purple prose, and we feature him as the quintessential noir writer, and we got to this at episode 17. This should have been first. And I admit that might be the fault of us being new to the genre and experiencing it in real time with this podcast. We do that deliberately. We're trying to be on a journey with our readers. But at the same time, the names that we hear and from where we hear them matter. And there's a reason why we hear certain names before others. So it's just, this is a great book. And we should have heard about her the same time we heard about Dash Hammett.
Yeah, I can't disagree with that. The only thing that I could say is that we have seen time and time again that mystery writers that write a series character tend to be better known and better remembered than authors that did not write a series character. And Hughes didn't write a series character.
There is that.
So
there is that. But Cornell Woolrich didn't write a series character either. So there is that as well.
That's a fair point. Yeah. That's a fair point. And there is one piece of historical context I wanted to add to this, and that is, we'll note that this book came out in 1947, and it takes place in LA. And at the beginning of 1947, we're talking January 14th or 15th. To this day, we still don't know. That is the date that Elizabeth Short, better known as the Black Dahlia, was murdered in L.A. So This novel came out at a time when the nation was talking about a serial killer in the area. And now the murder of Elizabeth Short was much more, all murders are graphic and grisly, but they're much more grisly than the Strangler found in this novel. But this was big news. This was a timely novel, and I'm sure, and who knows? I don't know how quickly Hughes had, wrote this, or if it was, she had something kind of started and then this Elizabeth Short thing came out and she cranked it out and finished it out. But timing is important often with novels, and she couldn't have hit the time better to release a book like this when the nation was thinking about a serial killer targeting women. I mean, because the Black Dahlia was not the only murderer of the time. There was a number of women who were killed in the general area under similar circumstances. But to this day, people are still writing books about the Black Dahlia. They're still debating who was the killer, and it still captures people's imaginations, I guess. So, and then maybe that's why In a Lonely Place is a novel that definitely stands the test of time.
Yeah, that's an interesting connection historically that I didn't know. But you said timing matters, and that's definitely an interesting little wrinkle in the fabric of noir history. The Black Dahlia being huge and memorable, essentially a pop culture event now, and this book sort of in its shadows, yet also in a sense riding on its coattails and being a nice complement to, what was a terrible event, nonetheless influential. So in closing, I want to read more Dorothy Hughes, and I love this book, and I want to write her biography, and that's about it for me. I feel like we've talked a lot about the significance of this book, and I don't really have anything bad to say right now about it. I think it's wonderful.
Yes. In a Lonely Place deserves a prominent place on the Noir bookshelf, and I will fist fight anyone who says otherwise.
Yes, I will strangle them. Wait, strike that from the record.
And it's time once again for 5-Round Burst. 5-Round Burst is where we review 5 books in roughly 5 minutes. And I believe today Justin has 2 selections and I have 3. And I will admit today that my reviews are a little on the lighter side. Today I'm going to do them kind of off the cuff, so be prepared for that. But what have you got today, Justin?
All right. First things first. Put out in 1992 by Avon Fiction, Lawrence Block's A Walk Among the Tombstones is the 10th book in the series. This is the Matthew Scudder series. Matthew Scudder is an unlicensed private investigator and recovering alcoholic, and he's offered a case from a well-to-do drug dealer whose wife was kidnapped, held for ransom, and consequently murdered. The drug dealer wants to find out who did it. With the help of his girlfriend Elaine and a young African-American friend named TJ, Scudder works his magic to identify the sadistic serial murderer, rapist prowling the streets of Brooklyn and Queens. And finally, of course, he may or may not bring them to justice. You be the judge of that. This is a well-written book. I actually really have been enjoying the Lawrence Block that I've read. It's not exactly pushing into new territory in terms of the PI setup, but what he does well is the way that he deals with Scudder's alcoholism. And this ties into the theme of our subject unknown from the previous episode. Scudder is not only a recovering alcoholic, we don't just hear about it, we see it. We see how he struggles with drink in the first several books, how he comes to the point of blackout, and then to the point of realization that he has an illness and that alcoholism is affecting him like a disease. And he hits rock bottom and deals with stress now by attending AA meetings, which we see as readers, and also by contacting his sponsor during times of particular stress. What I love is the character evolution. Makes the story realistic, makes Scudder feel like a real, flawed human being, the way that we want our private detectives to be. And this depth is more than we see with most PIs. This is a definite hit. All right, my second read today is our good friend John D. MacDonald. I returned to him after our critical review of Flash of Green. That book did not work for us, and I wanted to give him another chance by reading one of his McGee novels. This one's called The Green Ripper, and it's the 18th of the McGee series. It was published in 1979 by Fawcett Gold Medal, and it came out in the twilight of MacDonald's career. So the story features themes common in the late night news of the 1970s, religious cults, organized guerrilla movements tucked away in the wilderness. That said, the first 100 pages of this book are not new or new for MacDonald. They take place in McGee's typical Florida. We see his boat, the Busted Flush. We see him doing Florida things. But then his girlfriend Gretel dies of an unknown illness, and the cause of death turns out to be not just an illness, but poison. And the poison delivery system is sophisticated enough to draw the attention of the FBI. The loss shakes McGee, and in a way that's pretty cool. We get to see him suffering emotionally. The trauma, I think, is well rendered. But then, of course, the question is who killed Gretel, and he's not going to stop until he finds out who did it. So he follows the breadcrumbs. He leaves Florida behind and heads west to infiltrate the mysterious Church of the Apocrypha. He thinks the group is a spiritual cult, but it turns out that they're actually a militant arm of this sort of cultish church. They're well-trained foot soldiers for the revolution, a little bit of Maoism and a little bit of New Age woo-woo-ism. No matter, McGee is out for revenge, damn it, and he's going to get it. So he raids the church. I guess he sneaks in and becomes a double agent. And while reading this book, I realized something. As well as this book was written, and as much as I enjoyed it in part, I just don't care much for McGee. Maybe it's the Florida boat thing he has going. Maybe it's the way MacDonald writes him. I know he's a major player in Florida crime, and I keep trying to like him. And I will continue to try. I admit, I have several more of his books. I'm going to read them. But I just don't dig him. And I think part of the reason is I don't have an affinity for John MacDonald's worldview. I just don't quite agree with McGee as a character. In this book, I liked seeing McGee out of his element. We're not on a fucking boat, sleeping with women in Fort Lauderdale or whatever. I just don't dig that scene. Out here in the woods of Northern California, it's more my place. And I just like to see him out of his element doing things that McGee doesn't normally do. As for the themes in this book, we have a U.S. situated guerrilla movement. I think that shit's interesting. And I like that MacDonald explored the topic, though I didn't love his reductive take. He made the bad guys too easy to hate too quickly to justify the McGee vengeance that he wreaks upon them. I was hoping for a little more nuance, and it wasn't here. Nonetheless, if you want a change of pace from the typical McGee having sex with chicks on a boat formula, this is the book for you. I call it a non-fatal hit in the chest with an Uzi.
All right, so I'll get into my reviews. The first one up I have is The Woman Who Married a Bear. This is by John Straley, and it came out in 1992. It's the first Cecil Younger investigation set in Alaska. The story here is somewhat, I don't want to say straightforward, but in a way it is. There's a mother hires the detective to find out who kills her son. And again, here we have a fairly alcoholic, degenerate detective who still kind of tries to keep things together. Now, my big comment on this is, and I should have known better, I was thinking I'd seen this series before and I was interested in something set in Alaska, but I thought, well, this is going to get into like cozy mystery territory or something like that. And this couldn't be farther from that image. It's definitely still a hard-boiled type of story. There's a lot of rough and tumble to the story, and that makes sense because it's Alaska. And you're going to have people, everybody in Alaska's got guns. Everybody in Alaska wants everybody to leave them alone. You're going to have bush planes, fishing boats, remote communities of people who want to be left alone. And that comes up again and again in this book. And I really enjoyed it. And ironically enough, I had no intention of going to Alaska, but shortly after I finished this book, work called me and I ended up in Alaska for a few days.
Timely.
So, it worked out well. And I would give this a hit, maybe a salmon slapped across your face here for The Woman Who Married a Bear. And I know this series continues on. And
salmon slap is great. We got to incorporate that into future episodes.
Oh, sure. That'll be a whole new category of maybe in our rural shoreline noir category. If you get a salmon slap to the face is considered a hit. Yeah, check out these Cecil Younger books. I think they're big in the Pacific Northwest, but I don't know that they're that well known out of this area. So take a look at that. Up next, we have a anthology. This is called Dirty Boulevard, crime fiction inspired by the songs of Lou Reed. And this was edited by David James Keaton. Some of you may remember that I did a similar review for, I believe it was called Just to Watch Them Die, crime fiction inspired by the work of Johnny Cash. And this is along the same lines. A number of short stories in here inspired by the songs of Lou Reed. And as you might know, if you are familiar with Lou Reed and the Velvet Underground's work, there's a lot of drugs in this one. And I would give this a hit as well. However, this is more of a friendly boxing match in a back alley than the Johnny Cash full gunshot to the chest. I enjoyed these, but I think the difference was when I was reading the Johnny Cash pieces, I knew the music well enough that it was going off in the back of my head. I was, it was on a subconscious level it was going on. And I just don't know Lou Reed and Velvet Underground as well to have that happen while I'm reading these pieces. But I would give this one a hit, and especially if you are a fan of that music, you're going to want to check out Dirty Boulevard. And that just came out from that's from Down and Out Books, and that came out in 2018, so that's a pretty new one.
Cool.
For my last book today, now this is going to be, maybe some of you are going to say, why the hell are you reviewing this for Point Blank? But this is The Dawn Watch, Joseph Conrad in a Global World by Maya Jasanoff. And this came out in 2017, published by Penguin Books. And there's a couple of reasons why I'm going to mention this biography of Joseph Conrad. First and foremost, because of this show, I have read more author biographies since we started the show than I ever did before in my entire life. And most of them are pretty uninteresting, if I'm going to be honest. This is how you should write a book about an author. It is top-notch in that regard. It integrates both Joseph Conrad's his life, his work, and the historic and political context of what was going on during his life, and brings that all together. The author here really has a gift for how to bring this together, and I wish more people who are looking at literary biographies they need to read this book, and they need to see how to tell a good story. When most people think of Joseph Conrad, they think of either Heart of Darkness, which of course is well known because it was adapted into Apocalypse Now, or they think of Joseph Conrad as a writer of sort of the sea or nautical fiction or something like that. But The Secret Agent was also a Conrad piece. And while it's a piece of spy fiction, in a lot of ways, Conrad argued that it's also, maybe an early version of what we might call noir fiction, because he says it's about the ramifications of committing the crime, not the crime itself. So in that vein, I would say that he has a connection to the noir and crime fiction genre. On top of that, we can trace the fact that both William Faulkner and Ernest Hemingway cite Conrad as an influence, and all sorts of the writers that we've looked at in the crime fiction noir world look at Hemingway and Faulkner. And then we can also trace Conrad back to Dickens, and that was his big influence. So we're seeing part of this literary evolution that gets us into noir fiction. If you're looking for an interesting biography, and I don't think you need to be that familiar with Conrad's fiction to read this, but The Dawn Watch is a great book, and I would highly recommend it.
Coming up in future episodes, we have episode 18. It's going to feature Horace McCoy's They Shoot Horses, Don't They?, which is considered by some to be one of the first existential novels in the United States. That's followed by episode 19. We're going to go to another dead white man, Ernest Hemingway, and his lesser regarded novel To Have and Have Not, which I think is as close as he's come to writing a crime novel, and it deals with some interesting places, Key West and pre-revolutionary Cuba. Then we move on to episode 20, where we visit a not yet dead, but probably getting close writer, Cormac McCarthy, and his noir western No Country for Old Men take us into the Southwest. That leads us to episode 21 through 25 is our international literary road trip. We hit the road, we set sail, we are airborne as we wander the world from Marseille, France, in the Mediterranean, to Nigeria and West Africa, to Japan, Brazil, and then returning around to Mexico. And in each place, we're going to spend some time on the region's noir and crime fiction. So we really look forward to that adventure, and we hope you look forward to it with us. How do they contact us, Kurt?
Well, they can find us at Facebook, Point Blank Noir, Hardboiled and Detective Fiction. They can send us an email if they have questions, and we do like questions, at pointblanknoir@gmail.com. You can tweet us at pointblanknoir. You can also find, and I strongly encourage you to join our group on Goodreads. We have a nice community there. We discuss things prior to recording the show, and you can engage in the work with other listeners there. And there will be a link in the show notes for that. Otherwise, you can go to Goodreads and look for Point Blank under groups.
Sounds good. Well, we made it. Spread the word, by the way. If you like the show, give us a rating on iTunes, and then tell your friends or your family or your pets to check us out.
That's right. More iguanas should really be listening to Point Blank.
Yes, the entire species or genera of iguanas, we welcome you and your kind.
Big fans of crime fiction, those guys.
Yes, we'll do a whole episode on iguana fiction.
So join us for that future episode, but thank you for joining us today, and we will see you next time when we're going to get into shooting horses.
We're going to shoot horses with you next week. Bye, folks.
Bye-bye.
Point Blank is under a Creative Commons license. Music is by Justin. Copywritten works are property of their respective holders.